Hi, I'm Matthew Hall, and this is my submission for Stylized Assets and Digital Sculpting. So firstly, we need to define what we're going to be creating for this module. We're going to be creating a Sea Thieves-inspired island or environment, and a asset pack that includes all the assets that we're going to be taught about in this module and more, and we can also create a hero asset for our portfolio if we wish to. Moving on, some research about Sea Thieves and Rare themselves. Sea Thieves was originally published in 2018 on Xbox and PC. It was developed by Studio Rare and published by Xbox Game Studios. Rare are obviously known for creating many games such as Viva Pinata and lots in the past, and they have their own very unique style. The game was originally conceived in 2014 and was inspired by big MMO games such as EVE Online and Rust. Obviously, since its launch, it's released on PlayStation. Moving on to more the art direction side, it has three main pillars: an illustrative approach, which kind of focuses more on the low-frequency detail. We'll go into that a bit more later. A world in motion, so the world needs to be completely dynamic, lots of moving parts and nothing really too static. And a world of stories, there's lots of world building in their environments. And the game eventually develops into more of an exploration game than an MMO, where you dot around islands, kind of like Wind Waker. So yeah, moving on to our art breakdown of Sea of Thieves. So we need to define where Sea of Thieves gets its art style from and what style it's trying to create. Here is a shape language breakdown, where we can see they primarily use large boxy shapes with very limited secondary detail. And they often use exaggerated shape languages with like warps and bends for the majority of their assets. And then a lot of the time they use kind of fantasy characteristics to entice players into loot and being attracted to loot. They often have a very vibrant colours for their environments. Obviously deep ocean blue and very green foliage and whatnot. And the colours often change throughout the day, and as you'll see for my island, I've kind of prioritised making sure that my island looks good in each time of the day and different in each time of the day. Obviously, the colours of each time of day also impacts how the player interacts with the environment and how they might see the environment. Obviously, if you're looking at an island from far away when it's nighttime, you're going to see the lanterns and stuff and not the foliage. There's lots of implied detail in Sea of Thieves. One detail here is the thickness to these plants. You can see there's a lot of subsurface scattering on them, there's some coming through the mesh. Obviously that detail isn't there, but it's very much so implied. There's also shaders, a lot of them, which is very hard to recreate in the time frame that we have, but obviously here the water in the bucket would be a shader. And here's a asset breakdown that I did. You can see the dark red hues of this gunpowder keg, obviously symbolising to the player that this is something of danger, and the bones often in the game are a symbol of danger as well. Here you can see this is a piece of loot that the player must find in the environment. Obviously you've got that eye-catching, glowing emissive texture and quite jagged shape language. And here you can see this is a common piece of loot, so it's got more mute colours and more basic metallic colours. And Sea Thieves has lots of different biomes, 4 main biomes. The wilds, the shores, Forsaken Shores, and the Shores of Plenty, and the Ancient Isles. They all have very different colour theories to create different impacts on the player. Here you can see the super keg, which is obviously going to stand a lot out in the environment. It's very purple. And here is another piece of loot. Lots of secondary details in this one to get the player's attention. It's got analogous saturated colours. Here you can see I've done a workflow analysis for the environment. There's lots of portalized views, is what Sea of Thieves calls them, using assets to create views for the player and key points in the player's vision to guide them through an island. Using a lot of foliage here. Here's a vegetation analysis. Here they're using this red fern in the bottom right to symbolise where a lot of foliage is and show that to the player and make it obvious that this is a thick foliage area. They also use bushes and vines to cover up cracks in their environment design and cracks between assets. And then obviously flowers and stuff to liven up the environment. Here we've got some rocks. They've got a lot of time to make their rocks, so lots of different shapes and stuff, but here you can see they've made one that's very varied, and they've applied a world space material to it, which is what I'll be doing later on. And that basically means so they can scale it up and rotate it, and it will have different variations and look consistent with the game's PPI. Here's my first island blockout. It's an island to the player scale. I did scale it down a bit more than this, but this is my first rough draft. And then this is my first rough draft of where I think I'm going to place all my stuff. I'm going to go for this icy environment that I want the player to explore, and I kind of wanted the challenge of creating my own biome in the game, because I think that is very much so a more interesting challenge than trying to recreate pre-existing lighting and assets. Here is a very good example of how Sea Thieves translates assets to different areas. They often add just different topical variation to the assets. And also here you can see how in Sea of Thieves they prioritise texture resolution and textures and whatnot, and I'll be talking about that more later. Here you can see how they're using this basic like wood variation painterly effect on most of their assets when they're texturing them, and this just simplifies the workflow and makes it less intensive having to hand paint everything. They're starting this instead. And you can see here, even though there's not a lot of ambient occlusion in the game, sometimes they add a little bit. Here I got the Sea Thieves art book from the library, and I was collecting a couple of references, particularly stuff like this mushroom in the top left, and some of this foliage is very interesting. Here I'm starting my barrel. Obviously the barrel's a very important asset in the game, I'm going to be taking a lot of time with it. Here I've jumped a bit from my barrel blockout and imported it into ZBrush and started my sculpting progress. Here's my initial sculpt done, and I'm baking it down to the barrel's mesh and fixing some errors here. The barrel texturing I took quite a bit of time on, getting inspired from the painterly workflow that they used when texturing that blunderbuss saw earlier. Here I've added some icy variation because obviously my environment's Antarctic inspired. I did this with like a texture setup with a light and generators and stuff like that. And here you can see my UV and wrap and my poly count here in my low poly mesh in game, and my sculpt here, my final sculpt. And here's it in the game as well. Then I moved on to making a whale skeleton environment asset, which I had quite a lot of fun with, inspired by the Kraken in game, and I sculpted it. Moving on now to my skull. This was the first session's result. Definitely needed a lot more work. Here you can see me refining it, doing a bit of ideation, never really took off. Here you can see the final version of my skull and my teeth, the teeth I cut out because they didn't really look that good. My skull retopology that I did in Blender with an add-on, got a bit of feedback and I'm going to change some of this stuff. My skull retopo done, baked down with a high poly in Substance. I'm going to start texturing it. Here you can see the baked down version, obviously the UV on the top right. And here you can see my skull's final texture and emissive eyes and stuff like that. Very nice as well, I think. So moving on, that's most of the main assets done. So we're going to be looking at the island layout. Here you can see I'm doing some geysers, some placing where my whale skeleton's going to go, getting some inspiration from my icebergs and stuff like that. A dock over here, some stuff that may have been cut out, we'll see. Got a bit of an asset list here. This is after I'd already added some stuff, so we'll move on to that. Here in our foliage lesson I wanted to create some kelp for the underwater area because if not I thought it'd be very barren. Here's the very early stages of my grass, there's a lot more to come on this. I wanted to mix the Shores of Plenty grass with the wild grass and kind of create something that kind of looks shrubbish, which is mainly what you see in Antarctica. Here I'm making the material for my grass. So here I've added a gradient from the ground colour, some world space variation, some wind, and here is my final shrub-like Shores of Plenty inspired grass. And as you can see, my grass blends quite nicely with the terrain as it does in Sea of Thieves, which I think I really like the result. And here you can see I've added a bit more texture to my kelp, make it look a lot nicer, rather than just pure green. And here I'm starting my palm tree sculpt. Very early stages here, using our tools to create the initial trunk. And then I finished my high poly sculpt, got the winding aspect to the tree down, which you can see in a lot of screenshots of the game, which I was very proud of. And over here's my low poly remesh. Here you can see my palm tree leaf. I actually did this in Substance Painter. I'd made the alpha in Blender and baked it down. Over here is my palm tree mesh. Here's some examples in the scene. I made a beach seaweed asset, inspired by Antarctica again. A bunch of Antarctic flowers and foliage, which I won't go into detail here, but there's a texture map, I only used one. A mushroom, which was inspired by this piece of Sea Thieves concept art. Very happy with the result of this, it adds a lot to my scene with its emissiveness. And then here I'm going to get onto the materials of my scene. I made a snowy grass terrain material that I'm going to be using to texture my snowier areas and my higher up areas. I made a general rock material which I'm going to use as a world space material. The colour of this will change because I'm kind of changing the art direction of my island as I go. Bit more feedback on this, getting a bit more contrast in the material. And then here I'm importing it in. A bit more changes as you can see, as I mentioned. And then here, this was my final colour. I decided to go back with the classic grey, and this is it on a rock model that I made, which has a lot of variation, very similar to the one that we saw in the breakdown earlier. And here you can see, with most of the assets that I mentioned earlier, this is what my island was look like at this point of week 5. I decided to make an iceberg because, as you'll see later, my iceberg asset was just my rock, and it was looking a bit horrible. Here's my sand material, adds quite a nice effect to my beaches, makes it look very wavy and very Sea of Thievesy. I did a lot of additional variation to it. Here's my light source asset, I'm going with a campfire and a cooker. As you can see, blockout, remesh, the sculpt here, using lots of H polish and flatten and clay polish. Here it is in Unreal Engine, without the fire yet. I imported the stylized water into my scene. This is a showcase of the texturing style and how I was kind of replicating it. I used slope blur and directional blur to kind of replicate this style from that art breakdown before. some wooden plank assets that I used to make other assets like the docks and my ladders and my fences in my scene. Some wooden poles. I made some ice crystals which were inspired by the magma crystals that you see in the game. Here's a massive one on the top right, and I recolored it a bit to make it look like a magma crystal. Here's some more progress shots. Here's my poster decal. I did it with this whale asset, which I did get off Google Images, but I've edited a bit and stuff. It definitely adds to the world building in my area, if anything. Here's my campfire. I was really happy with my fire. Here's my campfire. I was really happy with my fire effects. I'll show you that later. Adds quite a lot to the scene. This I made some stone block assets for some ruins in my scene, and then here is my ice drum, which is the hero asset of my scene. I made this because I'm getting my friend to commission a music piece for my scene, which you'll hear later. Here's my fire particle. I made this all in Substance Designer and then pulled it in and then mess around with the particle effect system, and I got quite a nice result with some smoke and some embers and stuff like that. It was quite nice. And then here is my final island layout with a bunch of my portalized views and my viewpoints. In my main areas, I've designed some little areas very screenshot worthy. Here is my renders of my ice drum compared with the actual industry example. My ice crystals, my barrel. Jump into some of the renders of my final scene. Here you can see the whole island in its entirety. A nice shot of one of the portalized views that I set up with the ruins and stuff. Here's another shot with a little outpost down here in the bottom left. A dock at the side of the island I thought was very nice. Here you can see my island with different times of day. Here's in the evening, at night, and like in the summer hours. Here's the dock view. Here's my whale skeleton with a little pond that I made. And here's this very nice shot of my skull on this post and my decal at the back. So yeah, please give me a good grade, and I'm going to leave you with a video of my friend's music that I commissioned him to make for my project. Thank you very much.